Story recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a horror film based on a true story called the Amityville Horror. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. In 1974, a voice commands a man named Ronald to kill his family. Ronald loads his gun and makes his way to his parents' room. He shoots them as their blood splatters on the bedsheet. The shots wake up his siblings. To fulfill the voice's wish, he kills them one by one, leaving his scared sister, Jody, for last. Ronald finds Jody, and she asks him what's wrong. With tears falling down his face, Ronald murders the child. News of the killing spread fast throughout the county. Ronald claims he discovered his family dead. The police believe him at first, even granting him witness protection. But after further investigation, detectives charge Ronald with murdering his family. He eventually confesses and reveals that a voice told him to do it. A year later, a married couple, George and Kathy, playfully roll around their bed. Michael asks what his stepdad's doing to his mother, disrupting the flirty mood. After the interruption, they have a wholesome conversation about Michael's departed biological father. At breakfast, George serves Kathy's two other kids, Billy and Chelsea. The family talks about their plans for the day, and Kathy's more excited than usual. It turns out that the couple is looking through neighborhoods in search of their new home. They come across a house that seems like a bargain. Coincidentally, it's the home of Ronald and his family. The realtor stands on the driveway, greeting them with a welcoming smile. Kathy rushes out of the vehicle, ignoring George, who tries to tell her to calm down. Inside the home, George cusses at the sight of the drop-dead gorgeous interior. As a contractor, he assumes that the listed price in the newspaper is wrong because it looks much more expensive. The realtor says that maybe it's their lucky day. She talks about the history of the house, omitting the murders that happened. The couple looks out the window and sees a boathouse, which is convenient since George owns a speedboat. They enter the basement, but the realtor is reluctant to follow. She stays upstairs while the two check out the seemingly ordinary basement. Kathy leaves, and George looks at a clock radio displaying the time 3:15. Before leaving, George makes a wise decision and asks what made the house so cheap. As the realtor informs them about the murders that occurred, Kathy's perspective changes. The house that she once looked at as a home for their bright future is now shrouded by its dark past. However, George stands his ground and manages to convince his wife, saying that the house isn't at fault for the murders. In the end, they agree on buying it. Moving day arrives, and with a new home, a new life also awaits them. The family records the entire process of moving in. They carry a truckload of boxes, swim in the lake, and most importantly, allow their dog, Harry, to get acquainted with his new territory. When night arrives, Kathy kisses Michael goodnight, reminding him to pray. Billy voices out his opinions about praying, saying that his father still died despite his prayers. Kathy comforts her son while George listens outside. She tells Billy that George doesn't intend to replace his father, instead, he just wants to be his friend. The two finally settle in their bedroom. Kathy's mother calls, who seems to have a lousy relationship with George. While Kathy speaks to her, George feels cold, so he walks down to the basement to feed wood into the heater. He looks around the room as an eerie mood surrounds him. He hears a noise coming from the clock radio. It's still displaying the same time, 3:15. He checks on it, only to see it's unplugged. In the middle of the night, Kathy and George have an intimate session. As they make love, he sees a ghostly girl. She asks him what's wrong, but George doesn't tell her what he saw. The following day, George feels sick, and the sound of his coughs fills the house. However, this doesn't stop Kathy from hearing Chelsea talking to someone. She asks Chelsea who she's talking with. Chelsea says she's talking to Jody, who Kathy doesn't see. Kathy looks at her drawing, asking if it's Jody. Chelsea denies it as Jody seems to shush her, but Chelsea is only shushing back at an empty chair. Outside, George chops some firewood. Michael approaches him and shows him an object he found in the basement. Not being his usual cheery self, George orders him not to enter the basement again. Michael tears up, prompting George to quickly apologize. Back inside, Kathy tells George about a babysitter she found. She then asks him where Chelsea is, but George doesn't know. They call out to her as they look outside. Suddenly, the dog barks in front of the boathouse, and they rush to it. Once inside, they see Chelsea standing on the speedboat, holding a red balloon while staring into nothingness. George shouts at Chelsea, and she snaps out of the trance. She tells her mom that Jody wanted to see a boat. Kathy leaves, reminding George that he should have been watching her. Before going back inside, George locks the boathouse doors. Night arrives again, and Michael wakes up to his toys dropping from the shelves. He tries to wake Billy up, telling him that he has to pee. His brother is sound asleep, forcing him to go to the bathroom alone. Michael walks along the corridor and sees the unlocked boathouse. He runs to the white light inside the bathroom, relieving himself while watching the door. The scared boy turns the faucet's knob, but water doesn't come out. For a split second, he looks at the door, and when he turns back, a person with blood dripping from his mouth stands beside him. He runs back to bed and hides under the covers. Meanwhile, the windows open, chairs start moving, and thunder wakes George up. He walks to the kids' room and sees the bloodstained sheets. When he looks at himself, he sees a gun in his hand. Suddenly, George wakes up, and the clock radio displays at the same time again. He hears Harry barking and looks outside to see a red balloon floating out of the boathouse. He runs to the boathouse, thinking that Chelsea is there. Inside he finds no one. As he looks around, bubbles start appearing at the water's surface. George immediately dives in, but he finds no one underneath. After his night swim, George berates Harry for barking when there's nothing wrong. In one of the windows, Jody reveals herself. George sees Chelsea awake with Jody beside her. He rushes to Chelsea's room to find her sleeping. Inside her closet, two arms hold Jody up the ceiling. George doesn't notice as he's focused on giving Chelsea her stuffed toy. The night of horror ends, and Kathy awakens with George missing while Harry seems to be looking for something in the wall. George shouts for him to stop, and he sees ashes scattered in a corner. Kathy walks in on George sitting alone in the basement. She asks her what he's looking at, but George is also clueless about what it is. Kathy invites her to join her back in the bed, but George harshly denies her, saying she shouldn't treat him like her kids. George tells her the events of the night before. In his hands are the keys of the boathouse which he found in Billy's room. 2 weeks have passed since the first day they moved in. George talks to Billy about the keys he found in his room, but Billy denies ever taking them. They arrive home, and George orders Billy to carry the firewood. He mocks him and proceeds to get on with the task. Meanwhile, the magnets on the refrigerator form a disturbing phrase. While washing the dishes, a shadow runs past Kathy. She sees the magnets on the fridge, causing her to look for George. She finds him chugging milk. Kathy asks if he arranged the magnets on the fridge, but he looks to see them scattered. She disregards what she saw, but deep down, her fear grows. Later that night, the couple is all dressed up for a date. Billy complains about them getting a babysitter, then someone knocks on the door. Lisa introduces herself and removes her coat. At the same time, Billy also removes all his doubts about having a babysitter. George teases the flustered Billy. Lisa shares that she used to babysit the previous owners. This raises worry for the couple, but not enough to ruin their night out. At a local Italian restaurant, the two enjoy their deserved break from the stresses of having a new home. After a while, they talk about the challenges they're experiencing. Kathy asks George if his feelings towards her have changed. He assures her that nothing has and will ever change, promising that he'll make her happy for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, Lisa also relieves her stress with a hit from her bong. Someone knocks on the bathroom door, and she opens it to see Billy with a bowl of popcorn. Moments pass, and the high kicks in as Lisa sticks out her tongue in an attempt to copy Gene Simmons. The topic shifts to the murders that happened in the home. Lisa leans closer as she plans to tell Billy about it. As Lisa gets more comfortable with Billy, she talks about Ronald and how crazy he was. Michael enters the room just as they're about to get into the gory details. Lisa makes him cover his ears, and she starts telling the story, leaving out no details. The two are freaked out, and she realizes how terrible she is at babysitting. Their conversation leads them to Chelsea's room. Chelsea interrupts Lisa's story as she relays a message from Jody about how bad of a babysitter Lisa is. Billy dares Lisa to go into the closet in exchange for his kiss poster. She agrees and enters the closet acting scared. Suddenly, the door closes, and she starts to panic. The door won't open despite them tugging from both sides. Lisa starts crying in fear as the bulb flickers light onto the creepy dolls in the closet. Blood starts dripping, and Jody appears behind her. She shows her the bullet hole, forcing her to put her hand in it. She sees the scene of Jody's death, causing her to bang on the door furiously. Later that night, paramedics take a traumatized Lisa away. George accuses the kids of pulling a prank on Lisa. Feeling angry, he loses his cool and shouts. Kathy tells George to calm down, but he insists on changing the way they discipline the children. Billy blurts out that they know about the murders, and they don't want to sleep in their room anymore. George threatens them, and they run from him. Kathy follows with a fearful look on her face. In Chelsea's room, Kathy talks to her about Jody. She tells her that Jody scared Lisa away because she doesn't like her. She also says that Jody doesn't like George. The next day, Kathy and Chelsea watch George as he bosses around the two boys. At the dinner table, Kathy confronts George about how he's too hard on the kids. He then crosses the line by saying that he must discipline them because their dead father can't. In the basement, George overhears Billy and Michael talking bad about him through the vents. Suddenly, he hears another voice telling him to catch and kill them. The voice comes from the wall. George touches it and gets transported to a room. Blood flows through the ridges on the floor, and there he sees his bleeding self telling him to kill his family. In the bathroom, he pukes as he feels sicker with each passing moment. He washes his face in front of a mirror, removes his clothes, and submerges in the bathtub. Hands start to grab him and drown him. Kathy pulls him up as he continues to shout in fear. The doctor shines a light on George's eyes, asking if he takes drugs. George denies it and says he feels fine. The doctor agrees with him as his x-ray shows no injuries. However, he advises him to meet a psychiatrist. They arrive home and Chelsea's toy suddenly drops at George's feet. Kathy hears Chelsea's voice calling out to her, and there they see Chelsea on the roof. Kathy rushes in while George grabs a ladder. Chelsea balances her way to the opposite edge with her mother close behind. She says that she has to go with Jody as she steps off. Luckily, Kathy grabs hold of her shirt, but the weight pulls her to the edge. The shirt rips, and Chelsea falls to George's arms. Inside, the two argue about whether or not Jody is real. Chelsea insists that Jody told her to jump so that she could see her father. George walks in with a stuffed toy in hand as they talk about how Jody misses her father. He expresses his frustration and leaves. Later that day, Kathy introduces herself to Father Calloway. She opens up about their family's challenges. Feeling emotional, she tells him that demons reside in their home. Father Calloway tells her that the previous owners of the house had the same problem. Outside their home, Billy holds a log for George. With a swing of his axe, George cuts the wood in half. Billy is scared of him, and George teases him more because of it. He orders him to put another log. Billy's fear makes him hesitate. However, George persuades him with a threatening gaze and a slap in the face. In the basement, George laughs at the recordings of when they first moved in. Suddenly, he sees a demonic face patched on top of Billy's face. The clock strikes 3:15, and the voices wake George up. He goes upstairs to see the door open, seeming as if something's leading him outside. He immediately grabs his axe and drags it along the wood flooring. The voices lead him to the boathouse, and he slowly walks in. He nears a corner of the shed, then suddenly, a figure appears behind him. George swings his axe, and blood splatters on the wall. With a defeated look, he drops his axe to grab a bloody collar. Morning arrives, and George stares at his shaking hands as he can't believe what he did. Kathy suggests they leave, but he ignores her and starts crushing her finger. She pulls her hand, looking at him in fear and disgust. George calls her stupid for suggesting they leave. Kathy shouts that she doesn't care about the house anymore as she only wants their family to go back to normal. George focuses on the freezing temperature that seems only to affect him. They start shouting, grabbing the attention of the children. Michael says that they can't find Harry and George tells them that he probably ran away. Father Calloway visits the home while George continues to work on his project of nailing the windows shut. Kathy invites him inside, and his eyes shift onto Chelsea's doll. Outside, Father Calloway informs Kathy that Chelsea's doll once belonged to Jody. She knows about this, saying that the previous owners left it. However, he tells her that Jody was buried with the doll. Father Calloway opens up his case and starts praying. He blesses the room with holy water that instantly dissolves once it hits the floor. A noise from the vents distracts him, and the door suddenly closes. Father Calloway takes a closer look, and hundreds of flies swarm him like the plague of locusts. The door then opens, and a voice instructs the insects to fly out. Kathy runs after Father Calloway, but he's lost all hope for them. She turns around right into George's arms. Night arrives, and the voices consume George more and more. A screen turns on, instructing him to catch and kill. He exits the home, and Harry's barks haunt him. Feeling frustrated, George shouts and falls to his knees as he tries to fight his murderous intent. Meanwhile, Kathy watches from afar. On the 28th day, Kathy wakes up with a plan in mind. She visits the library to search for news about the murders. There she sees what Ronald and his family experienced that eerily match theirs. From the voices in Ronald and George's heads, both of them moving into the basement, the phrase "catch them and kill them" up to the 28th day when Ronald kills his family. In the basement, George starts tearing down the walls. As he pulls the planks, he feels a sticky substance. He looks in to see maggots crawling. Back in the library, Kathy finds library records of Reverend Jeremiah Ketchum. She reads a book that contains a picture of their house. George hammers down the concrete wall with a sledgehammer. He enters to see a secret corridor, and a figure jumps at him from a cell. At the same time, Kathy reads about the horrors that happened in the dungeon while George experiences them firsthand. Anxiousness grows as Kathy hurries to the church. She tells Father Calloway of Reverend Ketchum, who tortured Indians in his dungeon. The Reverend slit his throat as a form of ritual to keep his presence in the home. Father Calloway says Ronald approached him about the same problem before, but he didn't believe him. Now that he has a chance to change Kathy and her family's fate, he urges them to leave immediately. While all this is happening, George is in the Reverend's room with Ketchum's blood splattering all over him. A phone ring wakes him up, and he answers it. Kathy tells him that she wants them to leave the house, but George doesn't listen and destroys the phone. Kathy arrives and calls out to her children. She runs to the boathouse to find George. In the depths of the lake, George sees a figure. Kathy enters the boathouse and tries to convince George to leave. He shines his light on her, making her fall. The boat's propeller sucks in Kathy's hair, and George watches his wife drown. He presses a switch, further pulling her down. Finally, George realizes it's Kathy and lets her go. Kathy leaves him, thinking that he's too far gone. In the basement, Kathy and Chelsea see their custom-made coffins. The desire to leave grows, but George has other plans in mind. He carries Chelsea, palms her cheeks, and asks if she misses her father. Kathy pleads for him to let Chelsea go. They escape as soon as he let her go. With a gun in hand, George calmly makes his way out of the basement. However, Billy blocks the door with a shelf. The winds and the unholy spirits also block the escape of Kathy and her kids. Multiple doors and windows slam themselves shut, and their chances of surviving thins. They run through a corridor, but George catches Kathy by the neck. He starts holding her against the wall while Billy punches him. They escape George's grasp, and he shouts in frustration. They run after Chelsea, with George menacingly walking close behind. He shoots Chelsea's door, forcing it open. Kathy and the children are on the roof, and George shoots blindly at the ceiling. Billy sees him climbing out, and he starts to separate from his family. George reaches the other side, where Billy hits him with a pipe. His gun falls, and he follows. Kathy tries to open a window, but the face of a man scares her. She and the children make their way down, and George grabs his axe. Michael is too scared to jump, allowing George to catch up to them. He takes Billy and prepares to swing his axe at the demon hallucination. Suddenly, a gun's barrel touches his neck, and Kathy threatens to shoot. George calls her bluff, positioning the gun to his forehead. Kathy then chickens out. He looks back at Billy, and she hits him with the gun stock. George falls to the ground, and Kathy rushes to grab a rope to tie him up. George sits back up and swings his axe at Kathy's abdomen. It's a dream, and George shouts at Kathy, saying that she has to kill him. She assures him that nobody will die, knocking him out completely. Kathy and the children drag the tied up and unconscious George to the boathouse. They try to carry him into the boat, but he wakes up. In his head plays all the past horrors he experienced. As the sun rises, the family takes George away from the house. George calms down, seeming as if he's back to normal. They leave, not even returning for their belongings. In the home, Jody screams. The clock starts winding down, and the furniture arranges itself to look like nothing happened. As the clock displays 3:15, Jody lets out a tear and gets dragged through the floor. The home was built upon grounds of Indian suffering. Reverend Ketchum was obsessed with torturing the natives, and the horrors that happened in his time haunt the house up to the present. Ronald first experienced this when he heard voices and saw Indian markings on the television. When George and his family moved in, the curse transferred to him. It starts by being consumed by the voices which foster a desire to murder. Luckily, George escaped with help from his family, and Harry being his only victim. The endless loop was broken, but a loop always resets. By the end of the story, time turns back to 3:15, and Jody and the ghosts await the next homeowner. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.